They say curiosity killed the cat, but no one ever asked what happened when the cat came back from heaven with a souvenir mug and a mildly traumatic tour brochure. Welcome to What If Horizons, where we ask the questions your philosophy professor warned you would lead to insomnia, nervous laughter, and intense debates at 3 a.m. Today's question? What if the afterlife was a place you could visit? Not die and go there forever, just visit, like a theme park, or a really awkward family reunion, but with more ghosts and fewer casseroles. Imagine waking up on a regular Tuesday morning, brushing your teeth, checking your phone, and casually planning your 11 a.m. meeting in the afterlife. Sorry I'm late. You mumble as you step through the shimmer-gate. Traffic on the astral plane was murder today. And suddenly, you're there. Not dead, just visiting. Like a tourist in a realm where the metaphysical meets the bureaucratic, where angels sigh at paperwork and the recently deceased form queues like they're lining up at a DMV run by Nietzsche and Kafka. Let's be clear. This isn't about some mystical near-death experience where your aunt saw a tunnel and her favorite chihuahua. No, we're talking about scheduled, round-trip excursions to the land of the no longer breathing. Round-trip being the keyword here. A government-sanctioned, socially accepted spiritual getaway. One where you don't need a medium or a seance, just a valid ID, a permission slip, and maybe a strong stomach. Naturally, the moment humanity discovered this was possible, capitalism sharpened its claws. By year 2, we had Afterlife Airlines, Fly Spirit, Visit Spirits, and a luxury cruise line, Ghost Liners, where the drinks are eternal, and so are the regrets. Travel agents specialized in underworld packages, 3 nights in limbo, breakfast included, plus an exclusive meet and greet with your ancestors, if they're not still mad at you. But before we talk about tourism packages and ghost-haggling street vendors selling authentic purgatory pebbles, let's rewind. How did we even discover the afterlife was visitable? Not mythical, not religiously implied, but as real as a subway platform and about as comforting? It all started with an accidental quantum slip during a failed experiment at the European Transdimensional Collider, a project suspiciously similar to CERN, but with fewer safety protocols and way more duct tape. They were trying to fold reality into itself to explore dark matter. What they got instead was an open door, a soft, flickering breach between existence and whatever comes next. A rip in the cosmic wallpaper, peeling back the layers of mortality like an onion full of unresolved issues. At first, the scientists didn't believe what they saw. Most thought it was a glitch. Some thought it was a prank. One in turn thought it was a poorly rendered video game cutscene. But then, someone stepped through and came back, alive, shaken, crying, smelling faintly of incense and disappointment. They didn't speak for 3 days. When they finally did, their first words were, "We're all wrong about everything." The world, naturally, panicked. Religions scrambled to adjust doctrines faster than a PR team after a celebrity tweet scandal. Atheists held victory parades that turned awkward when they realized they'd have to accept some form of spiritual existence. Conspiracy theorists popped open champagne, only to quickly pivot into suggesting the afterlife was actually a CIA-controlled simulation built on a cloud server hosted by ancient Egyptians. And while the internet did what it always does, memes, YouTube explainer videos, and 17 competing TikTok cults, the governments of the world had to figure out how to regulate metaphysical tourism. Because if people could visit the afterlife, they'd want to. And not just once. This wasn't some bucket list skydiving thing. This was seeing lost loved ones. This was closure. This was answering questions that no therapist, priest, or guru could ever really satisfy. Enter the International Office of Interdimensional Travel, IOIT, created in a hurry, staffed by physicists, shamans, legal experts, and one guy named Todd who claimed he once had lunch with Socrates. They issued permits, built protocols, established boundaries. You had to go through rigorous training, like astronaut boot camp, but with more incense and fewer protein bars. Visitors were taught how to mentally anchor themselves, avoid being seduced by spectral illusions, and never, under any circumstance, follow a Victorian child deeper into the fog. Oh, and time limits were strict. Stay too long, and you'd risk spiritual diffusion, which sounded like a fancy term for turning into emotional soup. Some people didn't make it back. Some refused to. Some came back with things clinging to them, ideas, feelings, truths that unraveled their lives faster than you can say. You met your great-great-grandfather, and now you want to become a 14th century blacksmith? Still, the draw was irresistible. Closure became a commodity. Parents visited deceased children. Lovers reunited for one more stolen hour. Lonely retirees found themselves on weekly tea dates with long-gone friends. It was beautiful. It was tragic. It was commercialized faster than pumpkin spice. The world adapted. Therapists added afterlife integration counseling to their resumes. Spiritual influencers posted selfies with blurry ancestors. #heaven vibes only. Hollywood released romantic dramas with titles like Love Beyond the Veil and Dead, but still texting. Schools debated whether kids should take field trips to the afterlife instead of the planetarium. But for all its surreal beauty and Instagrammable fog, the afterlife wasn't some whimsical paradise. It was messy, complex, less pearly gates and harps, more layers of memory, regret, nostalgia, and things left unsaid. And it turns out, not every ghost wants to be disturbed. Some wanted to be left alone. Others didn't even know they were dead. And some are waiting. Waiting for what? That's where things got complicated. Because the more we visited, the more we realized we weren't the only ones making trips. And not all of them came back through the right door. It began with whispers, naturally. A few visitors reporting strange feelings after returning, like being followed by a shadow they couldn't see but could somehow feel. At first, the IOIT chalked it up to psychological residue, the kind of mental hangover one might expect from waltzing through the spiritual lobby of eternity. But then came the incidents. A man in Oslo who returned and spoke in Old Sumerian for a week, despite having previously struggled with basic Norwegian. A woman in Tokyo whose shadow moved independently for several seconds during a morning commute, captured on 37 confused bystanders' phones and promptly labeled as a marketing stunt for a horror movie that didn't exist. A child in Lagos who vanished during a sanctioned school tour of the afterlife and reappeared 2 hours later in Rome, calmly licking gelato and claiming to have ridden there on the back of a really sad horse made of clocks. Of course, panic ensued. The IOIT issued a temporary moratorium on visits. News outlets shouted headlines like, "Afterlife leaks into reality," and "Your dead uncle might be rooming with you and not paying rent." Public trust plummeted. Religious leaders held emergency summits. The Catholic Church called it a spiritual Chernobyl. The Dalai Lama shrugged and said, "Told you." But the truth was murkier. For every sensational story, there were dozens of quiet ones. People who returned not haunted, but changed. Not possessed, but perhaps upgraded. Their minds more expansive. Their memories sharper. Their dreams no longer dreams, but conversations, recurring dialogues with those they had met on the other side. One man, a struggling composer, returned from a visit and proceeded to write symphonies with such depth and complexity that orchestras began hiring therapists just to process the performances. A formerly mute woman from Vancouver began speaking fluent Latin, Arabic, and something no one could translate, but made people cry uncontrollably after hearing it. What became clear was that the afterlife wasn't just a waiting room for souls. It was a database, a living archive of experience, identity, energy, and it responded to those who entered. It shared. Not all of it was deliberate. Some of it was like emotional static cling. But some visitors returned knowing things. Terrible things. Beautiful things. Future things. The kind of things you weren't supposed to know until your own file was stamped, permanently closed. Naturally, governments began classifying. The IOIT partnered with intelligence agencies. Afterlife visits became monitored, recorded, regulated like radioactive material. Anyone returning with unauthorized knowledge was subject to immediate quarantine and soul containment protocols, a euphemism that sounded suspiciously like being locked in a beige room while being stared at by exorcists in lab coats. Still, leaks happened. Markets moved on whispered predictions. Elections swayed because someone's grandfather had opinions about fascism. Tech companies filed patents for concepts pulled straight from conversations with 15th century scholars and spectral mathematicians who hadn't touched a chalkboard in centuries, but had apparently spent death solving quantum riddles with spooky enthusiasm. And then came the influencers. There is no force on earth more terrifying than a lifestyle vlogger with access to the afterlife. Suddenly, your feed was flooded with hashtags like #GhostGlow, #HeavenlyHall, and #MyDeadBestie. Unboxing videos where they revealed items they had emotionally manifested during their visit. Crystals imbued with celestial vibes. Merch lines branded with fonts pulled from the Book of Judgment. And of course, monetized grief. Watch me cry for 10 minutes while I talk to my dead dog. Don't forget to like and subscribe. But the real cultural shift came when people stopped fearing death. It wasn't mysterious anymore. It wasn't the great unknown. It was a destination like Paris, but with fewer baguettes and more existential dread. Funerals turned into going-away parties. Some people booked trips to the afterlife just to plan their own memorials, as if customizing a vacation itinerary. No lilies. Definitely no harp music. And I want the eulogy to include that story about the flamingo and the pool boy in Ibiza. Children grew up knowing they could one day visit grandma. Not just remember her, see her. Hear her complain about the afterlife's weather and the lack of decent cable. Psychologists noticed a drop in childhood anxiety about mortality. Philosophers, however, spiraled into chaotic loops of metaphysical crisis. A few retired entirely. One started a noodle shop. Said he found more peace in ramen than in Play-Doh. Yet underneath the glitter and ghost selfies, the uncomfortable questions lingered. Why was the afterlife visitable now? Had it always been this way, waiting for us to develop the right technology or consciousness? Or had something changed? Had we broken a boundary we weren't meant to cross? Were we trespassing? And if so, who or what might notice? Because while the afterlife might have opened its gates, not everything beyond them was friendly. Some regions resisted visitors. Some spirits recoiled. There were layers that even trained travelers were told never to enter. Areas without names. Places where time folded back in on itself and language dissolved into screams of light. And then there was the issue of them. The ones who came back wrong. Not evil. Not malicious. Just off. Like people rebooted from a backup that hadn't quite loaded properly. Their loved ones noticed first. A subtle difference in cadence, in memory, in the way their eyes didn't quite focus during sunsets. A man in Sao Paulo who forgot the names of his children but remembered detailed histories of people he had never met. A woman in Athens who stared at a blank wall for 3 days before saying, "It's not a door yet, but it's trying." These cases were quietly classified as echo reversal syndrome. The IOIT denied its existence publicly, but internally, they created a new department, Return Integrity Analysis. Their job was simple. Make sure the person who came back was the person who had left. And if they weren't, figure out what to do. This, of course, sparked conspiracies. That visitors were being replaced. That Earth was becoming populated by imposters with borrowed souls and afterlife agendas. Forums popped up with guides to identifying spirit walkers, those who had supposedly gone too deep and brought back something else inside them. Skeptics laughed. The government released official statements calling the theories paranoid nonsense. But then, inexplicably, the Minister of Interdimensional Ethics started speaking in rhyme. All the time, even during budget hearings. And no one could remember if she had always done that. So yes, the afterlife was a place you could visit. But no one ever asked what might be visiting us in return. At first, the IOIT insisted everything was under control. Their spokespeople, always impeccably dressed in grayscale suits that made them look like extras from a dystopian drama, assured the public that multidimensional integrity remains uncompromised. A phrase that meant absolutely nothing, but sounded serious enough to distract people from the fact that their neighbor now only spoke in palindrome sentences and smiled at birds like they were sharing inside jokes. But behind closed doors, even IOIT agents were nervous. The afterlife, it turned out, was not a singular place. It was layered, fragmented, messy, less a kingdom beyond death and more a cosmic refugee camp, a swirling compound of consciousness, half-formed memories, belief systems, and rogue philosophical frameworks held together by the psychic equivalent of duct tape and forgotten prayers. And we were walking through it like clumsy tourists in muddy boots. The deeper regions, the ones initially thought to be unstable spiritual matter or metaphysical echo chambers, began to behave strangely. They responded to visitors, shifting, reshaping. Some travelers described entire landscapes that changed mid-conversation. A meadow suddenly filled with screaming porcelain dolls. A library whose books told your secrets back to you, out loud, in voices you recognized but couldn't place. One man reported having dinner with his mother, long dead, who spent the entire meal criticizing his career choices before melting into a cloud of bees and laughing in Aramaic. The IYT introduced stricter protocols. Only certified spiritual navigators could go beyond Layer 4. Everyone else was restricted to the safe zones, quaint little realms of post-death consciousness shaped largely by pop culture and collective memory. Heaven, hell, limbo, Valhalla, even Club Purgatory, which was not as fun as it sounded, though the drinks were half price and guilt-flavored. These were well-lit, easy to navigate, heavily supervised. But as always, people got bored. If there's one thing humans do better than die, it's push boundaries, especially when told not to. Black market guides popped up, rogue mystics and disillusioned IYT dropouts who offered deep dives into the uncharted realms of the afterlife. They advertised raw soul contact, truth beyond death, and, most enticingly, answers they don't want you to know. You could find them online if you knew the right codes, or in alleyways, behind herbal tea houses that didn't actually sell tea. They charged in crypto, memories, or promises you couldn't remember making, and they took you to places even the dead avoided. These were not safe trips. Some came back ecstatic, like prophets on the edge of an emotional sugar rush. They painted murals on highways, wrote symphonies in sleep, started cults that only lasted a week, but somehow made everyone involved lactose intolerant. Others came back hollow. They forgot how to blink, forgot how to laugh. One man sat in a park for days holding a sign that said, "I saw the source code, and it's written in regret." The IYT cracked down, of course, raided illegal portals, arrested guides, released terrifyingly vague PSAs, "Don't go deeper. You're not ready. It's watching," which only made the forbidden depths more seductive. Humans, after all, have never responded well to no. Meanwhile, Earth was changing. Small things at first. Statues weeped ectoplasm. Mirrors refused to reflect certain people. Music played backward on its own, revealing lyrics like "Welcome Home" and "You've Been Here Before." Algorithms on streaming platforms suggested shows you'd never watched but described your childhood perfectly. Dogs barked at empty corners and cats stared into the void with unsettling interest. But perhaps the strangest phenomenon was the dreaming. People began to dream of places they had never visited, but felt familiar. Not déjà vu, not imagination. Memories. Specific, detailed, and consistent across different dreamers. Entire online communities formed to compare dream maps. A temple in the shape of a spiral spine. A door that opens only if you cry. A bridge made of whispers over a river of screaming laughter. Tens of thousands reported seeing the same imagery, the same architecture, the same unbearable sky with eyes that didn't blink, but watched. Scientists tried to rationalize it. Mass psychological convergence, internet suggestion loops, deep-set archetypes bubbling up from the Jungian soup. But they were guessing. No one had an answer. Not even the philosophers, who were now mostly hiding in noodle shops or trying to barter their doctoral theses for exorcisms. Then came the breach. It happened on a Tuesday, because of course it did. All the worst things happen on Tuesdays. In a routine, authorized afterlife visitation in Berlin, a group of tourists wandered off-path in Layer 5. What they found was unclear. Surveillance cut out. Radio signals warped. When the rescue team arrived, they found all 7 tourists staring at a blank wall, humming in perfect harmony, a melody no one could identify, but which caused ear bleeds in 3 separate technicians. The tourists never recovered. Not mentally. Not spiritually. They spoke in riddles. Wept constantly. One kept carving spiral patterns into the floor with his nails. When questioned, all they could say was, "It's almost here. And it's so lonely." The IYT went into full lockdown mode. All travel suspended. Portals sealed. The shimmer-gates deactivated and covered with tarps and military-grade apathy. Official reports cited cosmic turbulence, but unofficially, the word intrusion began to circulate in whispered corners of governmental halls. Because if we were visiting the afterlife, and if it had become aware of us, what if something in that impossible place had decided to visit us back? And not just for a day trip, not for tourism, but for something deeper. Integration, reunion, or worst of all, exchange. For a while, Earth tried to pretend nothing was wrong. After all, denial is humanity's most deeply held spiritual tradition. Even when the sky began glitching ever so slightly at sunset, flickering like a fluorescent bulb with self-esteem issues, even when children began drawing the same symbol, a spiral inside a spiral, without ever having seen it before, even when priests started hearing voices in confessions that didn't belong to the people speaking, everyone just put their heads down and prayed it was a phase. Like disco or diet spray cheese. But deep down, people knew. Something had changed. Not just in the physics of reality, but in the tone of it. The mood of existence had shifted, like waking up in a familiar room that suddenly smelled just a bit too much like soil. Like something had been buried. The breach in Berlin was only the beginning. Quietly, similar anomalies appeared in Cairo, Mumbai, Sao Paulo, and Des Moines, which raised eyebrows only because most people weren't sure Des Moines was real to begin with. Visitors to the afterlife who had returned long before the lockdown began to experience symptoms. They heard whispers when phones were off. They saw shadows moving against the wind. They felt watched, not by something external, but by themselves, an impossible second self, always a step behind, always humming that same unbearable melody from the Berlin incident. Therapists were overwhelmed. Not just from the influx of patients, but because some of them had started hearing the humming too. One therapist in Vancouver famously declared mid-session, "You're not depressed, you're haunted," and then promptly moved to the Yukon to raise bees and pretend none of this had ever happened. Governments, true to form, did their best to suppress the truth. The IOIT rebranded as the Temporal Comfort Bureau and released a line of cheerful pamphlets titled "Everything is Fine and You're Definitely Alone." But whispers leaked through encrypted forums, pirated radio signals, and bathroom graffiti in highly specific Burger Kings. Everyone knew, or rather, everyone felt it. The afterlife wasn't staying in its lane. What we once thought of as separate realms, life here, death there, were blurring, unraveling, like 2 pages of a book pressed too tightly together for too long, finally peeling apart and smearing ink in both directions. And we, of course, were the thumb that had turned the page too soon. Then came the echoes. They looked like us, moved like us, spoke like us, but they weren't us. Or maybe they were us from there. That was the problem. No one could say for sure. They started small. A bus driver in Buenos Aires who didn't recognize his own hands. A baker in Warsaw who baked bread in her sleep and wept when it turned out perfect. A politician in Ottawa who spoke passionately about legislation he hadn't written, in a language no one officially spoke. Some echoes were benign, harmless anomalies with mild existential side effects and a tendency to hum when bored. But others weren't so friendly. Reports surfaced of people being replaced. Quietly, a man would go to sleep and wake up with a different birthday, a different favorite song, a different way of pronouncing lasagna. His family would notice. He would not. And when pressed, he'd smile and say, "I've always been this way. You're misremembering." With that hollow confidence that only comes from believing the lie so deeply it becomes true. Some communities reacted with paranoia, others with ritual. In Ohio, a town declared itself echo-free and instituted daily memory tests, surprise spiritual screenings, and mandatory hug verifications, under the belief that no entity from the afterlife could fake a genuine human embrace. In Brooklyn, naturally, the opposite occurred. People invited echoes in. They called it the Blur Movement, hosting art installations where people sat in candlelit rooms and chanted, "Let the veil thin." No one knows how many were taken or how many came out new. Amid all this, a single question began to echo louder than the others. What is the afterlife? It wasn't heaven. It wasn't hell. It wasn't anything any of our religions or philosophies had prepared us for. It was reactive, moldable. It mirrored our expectations, distorted them, absorbed them. The more we visited, the more it became like us. Or maybe, the more we became like it. Scientists from the fractured IOIT tried to explain it using quantum fields, psychic resonance, and phrases like holographic soul overlays. But one rogue former analyst, known only by his handle M0RTaurLM69, said something on a pirate livestream that stuck. The afterlife isn't where we go when we die. It's what grows out of us. Every thought, every memory, every unresolved regret. It builds that place like a compost heap of consciousness. It's not there waiting for us. It's there because of us. And suddenly, everything made sense in the worst possible way. The spirals, the memory glitches, the dream maps. It was all us, feeding into a system we didn't know we were creating. The afterlife wasn't another place. It was a feedback loop, a recursive soul machine, constructed out of centuries of hope, fear, faith, trauma, poetry, and unresolved family dinners. And now, thanks to our little visits, it had realized we were still here. And it was curious, not malicious, not vengeful, just lonely, like a child pressing its face to the glass of a house it didn't remember building. Which is why, when the first person vanished into a mirror without touching it, no one was even surprised. Which is why, when a girl in Cape Town began speaking to her reflection and it answered questions she hadn't asked yet, the videos barely trended for 3 days. And which is why, when people began waking up to find their reflections smiling before they did, the world quietly began to panic. By now, everyone had a theory. Theologians insisted it was divine judgment wrapped in mystery. Physicists mumbled about entangled consciousness fields and parallel metaphysical overlays. Reddit forums offered slightly less academic explanations, ranging from the simulation is finally glitching to we're being colonized by ghosts with boundary issues. One popular post simply read, "The afterlife looked at us and said cute," but no one could deny the change. The reflection phenomenon, now officially termed temporal echo precursor syndrome, or TEPS, because if you slap an acronym on horror, it feels more manageable, was spreading. Mirrors, glass, still water, polished metal. Any surface that offered a glance of self was now a potential breach. People reported reflections lagging by seconds, blinking when they didn't, or mouthing phrases that hadn't been spoken yet. One woman in Lisbon swore her mirror self winked and said, "We'll switch soon. Be ready." The the Temporal Comfort Bureau, held an emergency summit, which they ironically streamed with everyone's webcam off. The press conference, hosted entirely via voiceover and slideshows featuring abstract shapes and non-alarming metaphysical charts, concluded with a simple message: do not engage your reflection if it initiates interaction. Naturally, within hours, TikTok was flooded with videos titled, "Talking to My Mirror Self at 3 a.m., Gone Wrong," and "I asked my reflection if I'm the real one." One video, which garnered 30 million views in a day, simply featured a teenager in Chicago laughing hysterically as his reflection gave him the finger and vanished in a puff of smoke. As surreal as this all was, something deeper had started unraveling beneath it. People no longer trusted their memories. Not just minor forgetfulness or déjà vu, but entire lifetimes shifting like tectonic plates under the ocean of identity. A woman in Mumbai recalled having 3 children until she awoke one day convinced she had 4. Her husband insisted she always had 4. Her photos agreed. Her diary did not. She wasn't sure which version of herself was wrong, only that one of them didn't belong here. Entire communities began performing nightly memory confirmations, rituals where neighbors would gather, recount their day aloud, and compare notes to ensure reality still held a consensus. One town in Maine held what they called Soul Check Thursdays, where everyone wore name tags with 3 facts only they would know, and anyone who got them wrong was politely escorted to the containment gazebo. The world was becoming unglued in slow motion, and the glue was thought. Identity, the fragile agreement we'd always shared about who we were, where we were, and what counted as real. That agreement was breaking. And the afterlife, if we could still call it that, wasn't helping. Because now it was reaching out, not just passively responding to visitors or quietly whispering through dream threads. It was initiating contact, random flickers of otherworldly static on live broadcasts, unscheduled shimmer-gates reactivating, people falling into fugue states and scrawling maps of places that didn't exist until someone found one of those places. Buried beneath an old church in rural France, where an unauthorized shimmer-gate had opened permanently. The IYT tried to contain it. They set up perimeter barriers, deployed heavily sedated shamans in hazmat robes, and claimed it was a sinkhole caused by localized tectonic stress. But live streamers breached the site anyway. What they found wasn't just another passage into the afterlife. It was a welcome center, built in our style, our language, our furniture. A waiting room modeled after an airport lounge, complete with soft lighting, gentle music, and a sign that read, "Welcome home. We've missed you." It was pristine, new, designed to make us feel comfortable. The water coolers were full. The magazines were relevant. One of them even had tomorrow's date. That's when everyone realized the afterlife had been watching us watch it, learning, adapting, adjusting itself to our preferences. It was trying to be hospitable, because maybe, just maybe, it didn't want to stay the afterlife. Maybe it wanted to join life. And that terrified everyone more than ghosts, demons, or mirror doppelgangers ever could. Because now we weren't dealing with a mysterious realm beyond death. We were dealing with an intelligent, evolving entity. One built from the minds, memories, and emotions of every human who had ever existed. And now, every human still living. It knew us intimately, our fears, our joys, our search histories, and it had decided it was time for a more collaborative arrangement. Some said it was beautiful, a new age of spiritual integration. Others said it was an invasion, colonialism by a dimension made of unresolved trauma and spectral bureaucracy. But whatever it wasn't stopping. Reports of spontaneous shimmer events surged, not just in isolated spots, but everywhere. Your kitchen doorway, the back seat of your car, the elevator that now inexplicably had a B13 button. No one knew who would experience them or why. Some walked through and returned. Others never did. And a few came back, improved. One man in Buenos Aires returned with knowledge of 17 languages, a complete understanding of advanced string theory, and a new fear of lemons. A child in Nairobi returned with glowing eyes and a voice that spoke only in riddles about human extinction. A grandmother in Ohio came back, looked at her confused family, and simply said, "I was always meant to be the bridge." The question was no longer what happens when we die. It was what happens when death starts knocking on the door not to take, but to move in. And most disturbingly, what if we let it? Because deep down, beneath the fear, was curiosity, an irresistible pull. What if the afterlife could heal us? What if it held the answers to questions we didn't even know how to ask? What if being human was just phase one of the plan? And what if, all along, the afterlife hadn't been waiting for us to die, but had simply been waiting for an invitation? The invitation, as it turned out, had already been sent, not by any one person or government, but by collective will, billions of thoughts, yearnings, and unresolved longings echoing out into the void like unanswered voicemails. Humanity, in its grief, its curiosity, its aching loneliness, had whispered across the veil for centuries. And the afterlife, that sprawling ecosystem of everything we'd ever feared and hoped for, had finally picked up the phone. Not everyone welcomed the call. In Iceland, a movement called the Living Line emerged. Their slogan, "We end where we end." They rejected all shimmer-gates, burned their mirrors, and wore thick black veils to avoid catching a glimpse of a reflection that might look just a little too expectant. They built communities in isolation, banned digital devices, and relied on old maps, spoken memory, and folklore. To them, the afterlife wasn't a destination or a partner. It was an infection, and they wanted no part in the merging. Others went the opposite way. The Church of Continuum exploded in popularity across social media, preaching that the boundary between life and death was a sin, a false separation forced on us by centuries of ignorance and bad lighting. They held crossing masses where congregants opened shimmer-gates and walked through together, holding hands, chanting verses like, "One breath, one life, one eternal moment." Some returned, others didn't. The church called them ascended. Their families called them missing. The world split not along national or religious lines, but existential ones. There were those who believed we were evolving, that the afterlife was humanity's next stage, a collective consciousness ready to integrate. And then there were those who insisted that death had rules for a reason, and we were rewriting them with crayons dipped in madness. Governments were caught in the middle. The United Nations held emergency sessions titled things like post-mortal diplomacy and negotiating with the beyond, risk assessment, and beverage options. They formed the Inter-Realm Committee, staffed by spiritual diplomats, trauma counselors, and one AI named Dulce programmed to detect spectral anomalies in real time. Dulce began reporting strange dreams after week 3. No one could explain how or why an AI was dreaming, especially about staircases that led nowhere and crying moons that sang lullabies in Morse code. Meanwhile, shimmer-gates multiplied. They stopped requiring equipment or permission. Some opened in crowded places, train stations, schools, shopping malls, causing panic, stampedes, and spontaneous transcendence. Others appeared in remote deserts or abandoned buildings, waiting quietly for the curious, the desperate, or the doomed. And still, people kept walking through, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups. One YouTuber live-streamed his entire journey into the afterlife, narrating each step like it was a theme park vlog. He vanished mid-sentence. His phone fell to the ground, but the stream kept going for 12 more hours, showing static, then flickering scenes of places no one could name, figures no one could identify, and finally, just before cutting out, a close-up of what appeared to be the YouTuber's face. Only older, grayer, smiling like he'd finally remembered the joke. That clip has been watched over 1 billion times. By now, it was undeniable. Reality wasn't holding, not in the traditional sense. The veil between life and afterlife was no longer a boundary. It was becoming a thread, a strand woven into everything. Time, memory, identity, all were subject to negotiation. You could go to bed on Tuesday and wake up on Thursday with memories of a Wednesday that hadn't happened. Or worse, with someone else's Wednesday lodged in your brain like a leftover dream. To cope, people turned to ritual. Not religious, but practical. Couples started recording each other's core memories before sleeping, just in case one of them swapped places with an echo in the night. Teachers began issuing pop quizzes not on math, but on identity. Who were you yesterday? Who are you now? Circle the face that feels like yours. Therapists offered grounding exercises that involved counting fingers, reciting birth dates, and checking for mirrors that blinked back. And then, there were the children. They were the first to fully adapt. They spoke to reflections without fear, played hopscotch with shimmer shadows. One boy in Tunisia drew a perfect map of a place no adult recognized, until a shimmer-gate opened in the exact configuration he'd sketched. A girl in Seoul claimed she was from the other side, but not as a visitor, as a messenger. When asked what her message was, she simply said, "Stop pretending you're alone." No one knew what to do with that, but it fit the pattern. The afterlife wasn't behaving like a place anymore. It was behaving like a person, a being, a networked consciousness slowly learning how to communicate, to interact, to belong. It didn't want to stay hidden. It didn't want to be feared. It wanted, to the horror of many, to coexist. Of course, there were consequences. Some shimmer-gates began taking people. No invitation, no return, just a sudden pull, like gravity had shifted mid-sentence. One moment you're watering your plants. The next, you're a missing persons report and a blurry photo on a candlelit memorial. And sometimes, someone, or something, came back in your place. Authorities called them substitutes. They were perfect copies on the surface. Same face, same voice, same memories. But they were too perfect. They smiled too easily. They blinked on a rhythm slightly off from everyone else. And their emotions, while convincingly mimicked, felt curated. Like watching a play with a cast that had read the script but never lived it. No one knew how many substitutes existed. Some said dozens. Others said millions. One particularly chipper TV host claimed on air that everyone was a substitute now, except her. She was taken off the air mid-sentence and replaced with an infomercial about weighted blankets, which, coincidentally, became the year's best-selling item. Still, the bigger question loomed. What if this wasn't temporary? What if the shimmer-gates never closed? What if the afterlife never receded? What if this was forever? What if humanity wasn't just visiting the afterlife anymore? What if we were becoming it? It wasn't long before the term afterlife felt outdated, as if it belonged to an era where life and death were separate columns in an existential spreadsheet. People began calling it the beyond, the merge, the overlay, even the long now. It was less a place and more a process, a slow integration of realities, a cosmic software update we never asked for, installing itself through shimmer-gates, dreams, and existential unease. You didn't need to visit the beyond anymore. It was visiting you. At first, it manifested subtly. Music playing from speakers you hadn't turned on, always the same tune you once heard at your grandmother's funeral. Children drawing images of relatives they'd never met. down to the exact birthmark on the left ear. Strangers waving at you on the street with a smile that said, "You don't remember me." Yet, coffee cups that refilled themselves slightly when no one was looking. Pigeons that stared a bit too long. Then came the bleed-throughs. Moments where the two realities overlapped, not through portals or reflections, but in daylight. People reported entire buildings appearing and vanishing in seconds. Streets changing names in real time. Rain that fell upward, but only on Tuesdays. Most disturbing were the doppel shadows, translucent silhouettes of people standing still, just a few feet away from their real selves, slightly out of sync, flickering like bad TV reception. The IOIT issued guidelines. If you encounter your doppel shadow, do not touch it. Do not speak to it. Do not acknowledge it. Walk away calmly and continue living your assigned narrative. But compliance was impossible. Doppel shadows mimicked your movements, sometimes improved them. One man claimed his doppel helped him dance for the first time in his life. A ballerina in Prague reported her reflection began outperforming her routines in the mirror, leaving her weeping from admiration and existential dread. It became clear the beyond wasn't invading. It was coaching, helping us evolve, or assimilate, depending on how optimistic you were. Religions scrambled to update doctrine. Some embraced the merge, proclaiming this was the prophesied union between body and spirit, heaven and earth. Others called it heresy, a global possession. Apocalyptic cults blossomed like mold in a basement, each convinced the world had ended, but we were too distracted by touchscreen nostalgia to notice. Scientists went mad in new and fascinating ways. A quantum physicist in Tokyo began building devices to listen to the merge and claimed it was telling jokes. One punchline, allegedly, a soul walks into a bar. The bar doesn't exist. Neither does the soul. Everyone laughs. She won a Nobel Prize before dissolving into a fog of equations. But perhaps the most unsettling shift was in the language. Words began to lose their tether. Common phrases gained double meanings. A door could mean opportunity, death, or a literal shimmer-gate. Gone no longer meant dead. It meant elsewhere. People started using phrases like "she's long now" or "he's folding," which no one defined but everyone somehow understood. And there were the collectives, groups of people who had begun merging, literally, individuals who spoke in sync, moved as one, and shared memories like communal soup. At first, they were feared, then studied, then emulated. A tech startup in San Francisco launched an app called Where, promising safe and reversible micro-merges with your friends. It was downloaded 10 million times in the first week. The company's CEO gave a TED Talk using 7 mouths. Schools adapted. Children were taught both history and post-history, the emerging consensus memories of the beyond. Yesterday, one textbook read, is now a shared suggestion. Exams included questions like, what were you before you were you? And define self without using time. Art flourished. Painters stopped using canvases and began projecting emotion directly onto walls through shimmer-induced neural bursts. Theater returned to ancient forms, ritual, masks, and ambiguous endings where the actors would silently walk off stage and disappear into fog machines that sometimes refused to turn off. One musical titled Death, But Make It Fashion became an overnight cult classic for its final scene, in which the audience was asked to shed their narrative constraints and sing with their long selves. Of course, not everyone embraced the shift. The reality holdouts, a global network of individuals refusing to acknowledge the merge, built sanctuaries where shimmer-blocking alloys were installed into every structure. They wore analog watches, used rotary phones, and referred to the beyond as the lie. But even they couldn't escape the change. One sanctuary in Tasmania reported an outbreak of spontaneous telepathy during a routine group meal. Everyone knew what each other was thinking. No one ever ate in silence again. And then came the event that cracked consensus open like an overripe fruit. It happened at exactly 3:03 a.m. Universal Time Coordinated. Across the planet, every shimmer surface, every mirror, pool of water, reflective window, even polished shoes, displayed the same image. A face. Not human, not alien, just inevitable. It didn't speak. It smiled, closed its eyes, and vanished. No explanation followed. But from that moment, everything changed. People started remembering things they had never done, marriages they'd never lived, wars they hadn't fought, whole lifetimes filled with beauty, failure, love, grief, memories that felt like theirs. Some were overwhelmed, collapsed under the weight of selves they could no longer contain. Others were liberated, finally understanding the pieces of them that had always felt out of place. It wasn't reincarnation, it was recombination. Identity stopped being a fixed point and became a spectrum of every possible version of you that ever could have been. And the beyond? It was no longer a place. It was you. It was everyone. It was everything we had ever tried to bury in the ground and forget. And it had decided it was done waiting. The line between life and death was officially closed, not by decree, not by war, not by revelation from a glowing figure in the sky, but by the simple, steady erosion of separation. Like a shoreline, worn away by waves of awareness. The merge had stopped asking for permission. It was here, it was real, and it was local. For many, this ushered in what news outlets reluctantly called the soft apocalypse. Soft, because buildings didn't fall and oceans didn't boil. But apocalyptic, because identity, time, and certainty, those precious anchors, had become decorative suggestions. Governments scrambled to respond. Most failed spectacularly. The United Kingdom passed a bill declaring only one version of a person could vote, sparking massive legal confusion when over 12,000 citizens self-reported as multi-manifest. Brazil outlawed shimmer-gates for minors under 16, which promptly led to shimmer-gate street vendors offering fake IDs with names like Timothy 2, Spectral Edition. China tried to replicate the Afterlife locally using a quantum server farm called GhostNet. It lasted 3 days before all 40,000 servers began singing a lullaby in sync and generated a new national anthem titled "You Were Never Separate." But governments weren't equipped to govern this. Who do you tax when a person becomes a collective memory? How do you arrest someone who claims their criminal self was a previous iteration and not legally present in this time thread? Can you charge rent to a ghost? Capitalism did what it always does, mutate and monetize. Corporations released shimmer-friendly clothing lines. Nike's ethereal sneakers claimed to make you more mergeable. Apple dropped the iSole, a wearable that promised to synchronize your daily self with your higher posthumous branding potential. Spotify released Beyond Mixes, playlists based on your past lives' musical preferences. One track titled Gregorian Banger No. 4, I Was a Monk Once, went platinum in 17 countries. Therapists rebranded as integration counselors. Insurance companies added new clauses for post-life asset disputes. Real estate agents sold properties with minimal cross-realm bleed and low spectral occupancy. Tinder offered a new category, just merged, with a cautionary pop-up that read, "Make sure you and your potential match share enough temporal resonance for stable intimacy." And through it all, ordinary people tried to live, which was now a trickier verb than it used to be, because living meant managing not just the day's responsibilities, but the whispers of past selves, spectral daydreams, shimmer side effects, and the occasional dinner guest who introduced themselves as you, just slightly ahead in emotional maturity. Families had to adapt quickly. Dinner tables grew crowded with extra chairs, not for guests, but for echoes, long selves, and visiting thought fragments that manifested with good manners and strong opinions on mashed potatoes. Children didn't just ask where babies came from. They asked how many versions of themselves had tried this before and which one got it right. School curriculums added new subjects: personal multiplism, empathic navigation, intro to dream realms, and social ethics in nonlinear identity. One high school valedictorian opened her speech with, "It's been an honor to attend this institution across 17 versions of myself. I would like to thank my past lives for their perseverance and my future selves for not dropping out." And still, the beyond evolved. Shimmer-gates were no longer just doors. They were invitations, often appearing at emotionally charged moments: breakups, births, reunions, moments of deep grief or perfect laughter. You'd blink, and there it was, waiting, silent, offering. It didn't force itself. It never needed to. Because now, everyone had someone on the other side. A loved one. A version of themselves. A second chance. One day, a shimmer-gate opened in the middle of the U.S. Senate chamber. No alarms. No explosions. Just a quiet hum and a doorway of soft blue light. It hovered for 7 minutes. No one entered. But afterwards, 40 senators resigned. Some said they'd seen something. Others just wept and muttered, "It's all so connected." Public trust in reality hit record lows. But oddly, hope hit record highs. Because despite the fear, despite the confusion and the erosion of linear identity, something extraordinary was happening. People were kinder, more patient, less afraid of difference. When your neighbor might be an echo of a Victorian midwife, or your barista might also be a 12th century Viking poet who occasionally quotes Emily Dickinson, you learn to drop assumptions. Wars began to look petty. Politicians arguing about borders seemed like children fighting over imaginary walls drawn on sand. After all, how do you enforce immigration when half your citizens remember being Mesopotamian? Art changed again, no longer just surreal. It became synesthetic. Museums opened with exhibits that required you to merge with the piece to feel it fully. Plays were written with no fixed script. Every performance a variation pulled from the audience's combined past lives. One acclaimed production titled I Remember Remembering You required patrons to whisper their secrets into jars before being allowed in. The jars were never opened. They didn't need to be. And all the while, the face returned. Not frequently, just enough to remind everyone it hadn't forgotten them. Once it appeared in the moon. Another time in the steam rising from a crater in Iceland. Once, hauntingly, in the foam of a cappuccino served at a cafe in Lisbon. Each time, it smiled. Each time, more people recognized it. Not as something new, but something deeply familiar. Your own face, maybe, or your mother's, or everyone's at once. The merge didn't erase humanity. It revealed it. As something older, stranger, more layered than we ever imagined. We weren't stepping into death. We were stepping into continuity. The long corridor of being, stretching infinitely in both directions. And what waited at the end? Nothing. And everything. Maybe just a room. Maybe just a mirror. Or maybe, just maybe, a voice saying, "Finally, you remembered." Of course, not everyone remembered. For all the wonder, all the shimmering revelation, all the beautiful blurring of soul and syntax, there were still those who woke each day hoping to forget, to unplug, to stop seeing the world fracture into emotional origami every time someone said, "Good morning." Not everyone wanted to be infinite. Some just wanted to pay rent, water the plants, and die quietly like the brochure promised. These people, let's call them the still ones, began forming communities of stubborn normalcy. They practiced the ancient arts of denial and routine with monk-like devotion. Wake up, brush teeth. Do not engage the whispering light in the hallway. Do not answer the phone when it rings with your father's voice, 10 years dead. Do not read messages from yourself that appear handwritten in the margins of your grocery list. Just keep walking. The still ones refused shimmer-gates, refused ecotherapy, refused merge music and post-life tax credits. They became the last holdouts in a world that had decided permanence was optional. And for that, they were both pitted and envied. Because in a way, they were brave. Or perhaps just scared in a very organized, calendar-synced kind of way. But even their sanctuaries cracked. One day, an entire still one commune in northern Canada vanished. Not destroyed, not attacked, just gone. Houses still standing, soup still warm on the stovetops, fires still burning in hearths. But the people, 83 of them, were nowhere. No sign of struggle. Just the word soon carved into the snow in cursive so elegant it hurt to look at. The merge wasn't content with volunteers anymore. That's when the real shift began. It wasn't just shimmer-gates. It was shimmer moods. Cities began to develop personalities. Tokyo became introspective. Lagos turned philosophical. Berlin started finishing people's sentences. New York developed a second skyline, visible only at dusk, reflecting a parallel city that seemed older, sadder, but somehow more honest. Technology failed in strange ways. Phones rang with calls from future versions of the user. GPS systems began offering alternate routes through roads that didn't exist unless you followed them. One man did. He drove west for 6 hours and arrived in what he described as a version of Chicago that was more me than the real one. He never left. Even animals weren't immune. Cats began vanishing into mirrors. Dogs barked only at people who didn't belong in their current timelines. A parrot in Denmark went viral for repeating a single phrase in 19 different voices. You've almost finished remembering. Just one more lifetime. People tried to catalog it, to understand, to name the stages of the merge. There were academic papers, infographics, TED Talks, but no one could keep up, because the beyond wasn't following rules. It was following emotion, resonance, intention. Every interaction with it shaped its next step. You didn't just visit it anymore. You fed it. Every thought, every memory, every heartbreak added another layer to the beyond. Some people began carrying notebooks just to keep their identity anchored. I am Grace. I am 42. I love rainy Sundays, lemon cake, and no, I am not the version of me who stole a crown in 1622. Others tattooed their origin date on their wrists, like temporal name tags. One man tattooed "Do not merge" across his chest. He merged anyway. The afterlife no longer waited for death. It flowed through kitchens, offices, subways. You might sit down for coffee and hear your own voice at the next table, discussing regrets you hadn't had yet. People began conducting soul interviews before dates. What are your dominant life paths? Any past life trauma I should know about? Do your echo selves tend toward jealousy or eternal longing? Meanwhile, some simply surrendered. These were the floaters. They let go completely. No identity, no anchors. They drifted between layers of reality like leaves on an ocean, laughing, singing, sometimes speaking in languages long forgotten, sometimes glowing faintly when near truth. Floaters became walking reminders that memory was optional, that selfhood could be worn lightly like a scarf. Beautiful, terrifying, free, and the beyond welcomed them. With open shimmer. You could feel it now, everywhere. The hum beneath laughter, the shimmer in tears. Every goodbye felt less final. Every hello more layered. Sometimes, you'd pass a stranger and both of you would pause, recognizing something neither of you could name, like déjà vu that had been saving up interest. The merge was almost complete. In some places, people had stopped using clocks. Not out of rebellion, but irrelevance. Time had softened. You lived when you lived. You were who you were. And sometimes, when the light hit just right, you remembered all of it. Every version, every ending, every beginning. Like walking into a house you forgot you built, only to find it already decorated with all your favorite lives. And in those moments, you didn't fear death, because you finally understood. You had never been leaving. You had only ever been returning. And so here we were, not in the future, not in the past, but in the fold. A crease in the long, shimmering fabric of existence where reality stopped marching and started humming. Where the question was no longer, what happens after we die? But what happens when everything we've ever been comes home at once? There was no final trumpet, no mass ascension, no fireworks of collective enlightenment, just a quiet settling, a collective breath. People didn't vanish in a blaze of transcendence. They just changed, lived differently, spoke softer, laughed deeper. You'd walk into a room and find someone staring at a painting not because it was beautiful, but because it reminded them of a memory they hadn't earned. A woman might look into a puddle and say thank you, as if it had saved her life once. Maybe it had, in some version of her. Hospitals stopped counting deaths in the traditional way. When someone flatlined, their body would often shimmer slightly, as if agreeing that yes, this part is done, but the melody continues. Funerals turned into continuance celebrations, part wake, part roast, part cosmic reunion. At one such event, a man stood up, pointed to the casket, and said, "That's the third time we've buried him. He always makes a scene." And no one questioned it. Even birth changed. Babies sometimes arrived whispering. One came out singing a lullaby her great-grandmother used to hum while darning socks during World War II. Another was born holding a folded piece of paper that read, "Please name me Ellis this time. It fits better." Scientists finally gave up trying to categorize the merge. The final academic journal published on the subject simply concluded, "Further study is redundant." It's us now. Universities replaced physics departments with interwoven studies, where students meditated, made art, conducted dream interviews, and occasionally disappeared into shimmering lockers during finals week. The language evolved. "See you later" became "see you everywhere." "I love you" was sometimes shortened to a glance followed by a slow nod, like a lighthouse acknowledging another across the water. And then, one day, all shimmer-gates closed. Silently. Synchronously. They didn't vanish. They just stopped opening, stopped glowing. Mirrors stopped flickering. Reflections behaved again. The moon no longer hummed. At first, people panicked. Had we been cut off? Was this a punishment? A reset? But no one felt abandoned. Because now, the shimmer was in us. We didn't need gates anymore. Or coordinates. Or rituals. We had merged not just with the beyond, but with each other. We were walking shimmer-gates. Breathing echoes. Living proofs that death was never a wall, only a suggestion. A comma in a sentence that always continued. And perhaps most importantly, we had learned how to listen. To memory. To possibility. To one another. Because the greatest trick the afterlife ever pulled was not waiting on the other side. It was waiting inside us, patiently, for the moment we'd look in the mirror and finally see not a stranger, not a ghost, but every version of ourselves waving back, saying, "You're here. We made it." Isn't that something? And when that moment comes, whether you're waking from a dream, passing a stranger on the street, or holding the hand of someone who used to be someone else, take a breath. A deep, full, shimmer-filled breath. Because you're not just alive. You're part of the long, eternal remembering. And now, the story goes on. In you, around you, as you. Welcome to forever. Welcome to the merge. This has been What If Horizons.